Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. And today I'm just going to be talking about the books that I've read this week. And it's been a fun one. I suppose the weirdly nice thing about it being freezing here in the UK has been that I've just been sort of snuggling up with some books. But it's been a fun reading week. So let's get talking about some of those here. First up, One Last Song by Nathan Evans, which is due to come out in February. And it's published by the lovely Incandescent Press, who are just brilliant anyway. But this is Nathan, who is one of the sort of founders of it as well. And this is just a really beautiful book. And I think that the really nice thing that you sort of see in the acknowledgements part at the end of this book is that this is a book that started off as sort of being little monologues read on stage or sort of little snippets here and there. And actually that's the feeling I got when I was reading it. So I was quite pleased to see that in the acknowledgements, because it really feels like a sort of, like a really beautiful play or a film. But the core idea is focused around two men in a sort of care or nursing home. One, John, also known as Joan throughout the narrative, and Jim, if I've got their names right, yes. And the main thing here is that Joan is this sort of flamboyant, fabulous, kind of Quentin Crisp-like figure, kind of, as you might be able to tell, sort of here. And Jim is a little bit more kind of straight down the line, sort of fairly regular. And they both end up in this nursing home, and Joan is this sort of breath of fresh air in many ways to this nursing home, walking around this really beautiful, flamboyant, energetic, vivacious kind of way. But there's also this sort of undercurrent of something a little bit more potentially tragic, because we also know, because he's in a nursing home, his health is dwindling. And so there's some element where he's sort of doing all this sort of fabulousness, but ultimately something, he still sort of is contending with the same things as everybody else. This is almost like a final swan song. That wasn't an intentional pun on the name, but I just realized what's going on there. And then we've got Jim, and Jim is, at first a little bit hesitant around Joan, as everybody is. A lot of people in the nursing home refuse to call him Joan, and will just sort of default to John. And there's this sort of thing about this sort of, sort of challenging expectations sort of within this nursing home. Anyway, this isn't spoiling it because it's sort of mentioned in the back here, but basically Jim sort of comes to sort of see Joan and is sort of like, well, actually this sort of unravels a bit about himself and his own relationship to his sexuality and his own thoughts around who he is. And what really kind of comes from it is just this really beautiful partnership between these two men, of just this sort of these beautiful descriptions of the ways that they both move through the world. Joan is written in such an engaging, the novel splits between the two characters. It sort of jumps between both of them. And there's something so beautiful about the kind of utter camp vivaciousness of someone like Joan, where it's really in that kind of Quentin Crisp sort of voice that really, just no sentence is dull coming from Joan's lips, and it's just brilliant. And I mean, it's just a really beautifully told book with a lot of heart. I also made the mistake, I started reading it on the way to go and see a friend, finished most of the book on that journey because it's a relatively short book and I was just really tearing through it. Watched the end of It's a Sin with my friend, and then on my way home read the last bit of this book. And let me tell you that the double whammy of It's a Sin and the end of this book was a bit much, in the most beautiful way. Both books deal so tenderly, both It's a Sin and this book deal so tenderly with kind of the queer experience, and it was just such a beautiful, tender book to read. So yeah, I really, really greatly appreciated this. Next up, I read Brooklyn by Colm Tóibín. And I love Tóibín from the bits of his I've read before, and Brooklyn was the one that was always sort of touted as one of the books that was sort of he's best known for and was sort of really out there. And I really enjoyed this story. The kind of the main sort of gist of it is that we have a young woman, Ailish, who is in Ireland, is sort of, working, doing bits and sort of odd jobs here and there, and is sort of trying to find a life for herself. And, somebody she knows tells her that there's a job waiting for her in New York. So she boards a boat, she goes over there and she starts working there, and she has this entire new life. But this book really probes the sort of push and pull thing of moving to a different place. So not only the kind of expectations when she comes back, that, when she comes back, are people going to still talk to her? Are they just going to be asking her for money? Is there a sense that she's betrayed her family by moving over? All of these sorts of considerations come up, and it's so tenderly done, I think, in that sort of portrait. But it really explores her as this sort of growing young woman, her sort of trying to work out who she is, trying to strike out on her own. And this was a common thing at the time, where lots of Irish people moved to the US in sort of search of new lives. And because of that, there was this sort of culture around, she's warned before she leaves Ireland that, some people say to her things like, oh, well, you better say goodbye to some of these people now, because they're not going to want to talk to you again, and they're not going to feel the same way about you when you come back, and all of these sorts of things. And so she really feels aggrieved and pained at sort of these things. But she then has a sort of difficult decision to make about what to do next, really, which will also be explored, I'm presuming, in the follow-up. So I started reading it and then heard that there was a follow-up, and I was like, oh, great timing. So Coney Island, I believe, is coming later this year, which is the follow-up book to this. So I'm excited to see what happens next in Ailish's story. Keeping with fiction, next I read The Fraud by Zadie Smith, which literally just after I started reading it and found out that it was shortlisted for the Writers' Prize, which is formerly the Rathbones Folio, which is very exciting. But yeah, it's interesting because I've seen sort of mixed responses to The Fraud going around, partly because I think Zadie Smith normally writes these very contemporary novels that often really deal with sort of specific issues and sort of specific topics in a very modern sort of view of the world, and sort of really set in the contemporary times. And this is her first historical novel. And actually, I think it's interesting. I can see why why it didn't land maybe as well as some of her other novels, but I still think this is a really engaging story. Kind of at the core part of it, the title refers to sort of various schemes and things that are going on. There are kind of court cases. There are these things all going on in this sort of Victorian England time. We've got this sort of wide, interesting range of characters, and it references Dickens and Thackeray a few times, and in many ways it is a sort of natural sort of successor to those in some ways. It's written kind of in that style. And I think what's interesting here as well is I've heard a couple of interviews with Zadie Smith, who talks frequently about her real respect and love for the traditions and history of the English novel, and particularly the English novel in the sense of people like Dickens and Thackeray and a few others. And so it's interesting to see in this book her kind of nod to it, because this does feel in some ways like a love letter to those authors. And without giving anything away in the plot, I actually think it kind of builds to something quite propulsive. I found it quite readable. I listened to the audiobook as well, which has Zadie Smith's voice. She's surprisingly good. I don't know why surprisingly, but she's very good at doing other accents and voices. And it's very engaging as well. So yeah, I've really enjoyed her book. Maybe not, it doesn't maybe compare as much to something like On Beauty, which I adored, but I still think it's a very, very solid novel in its own way. Next up, something very different indeed. We have The Grassling by Elizabeth Jane Burnett. And somebody in the comments very, very kindly pointed this book out because I had her other book recently, 12 Words for Moss, in my top non-fiction of the year. And this is sort of, this book came before and is a really interesting book where, again, she's sort of exploring nature through various different sort of avenues. And particularly her writing is really interesting for the fact that she'll have something that's much more poetic in form and in sort of style, and then she'll have something that's more of a non-fiction piece and something that feels a bit more fictional. She sort of blends different bits of writing together really comfortably, I think. And The Grassling, I just thought was a beautiful way of looking at nature, and particularly looking at the sort of the kinds of ways that we our relationship to nature is really important to us. So she talks a lot about the land that her family sort of can trace back, and trying to find the names that that made those places. So Drew Hill kind of coming from Druid Hill and all these things, and sort of looking back and back, and kind of almost tracing a lineage. And for her, it's quite interesting as well, because, you know, one side of her family, sort of white British, has been on this part of land for a very long time. Her mother is Kenyan, and her relationship to words for land are really interesting as well, in terms of how she describes areas around Kenya, and particularly the area they grew up in. So really interesting, kind of these sorts of, I suppose, yeah, kind of how land and nature and human lives kind of intersect in this really interesting way. And last but not least, keeping with nature for a very different book indeed. This is The Wisdom of Sheep by Rosamund Young. And her other book, The Secret Life of Cows, I really greatly enjoyed. And this is very similar. She is, so sort of for a good part of her life, she's worked on farms. And she writes really beautifully about how animals sort of have their own sort of quirks and personalities. And so she will be tending a group of cows, and she knows that there's one cow that's always going to try and get a little bit of extra food, or there's always one cow that is a little friendlier but also doesn't like this other thing. And so she sort of comes to learn their quirks. And it's interesting because she often talks about it almost through the guise of language of, you know, we often think of cows and sheep and kind of animals like that, sort of farmyard animals, as being these sort of stupid things that are all kind of sort of a monolith, and you sort of tell them what to do and they go and do their thing, and they might be a bit stubborn, but whatever. But she sort of watches as the little relationships form between them, you know, how a mother will look after her young, or how, you know, 3 generations down, a cow is doing the same trick to try and get extra apples from you know, from the farmers. And so just all these little things and how they intersect. And so it's just really beautifully done and really tender. And it was a nice read. This was a very good early year read, I think, for me. And that brings all of my books to the end. That's all the books I read this week. I hope you're having a really good reading week and a really good start to 2024, almost at 23. And I hope you're doing really well. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.